It's the week ending Saturday, the 15th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the escalation of violent exchanges between Israel and Palestine, a botched Labour reshuffle promoting Rachel Reeves to shadow Chancellor, and the UK's first day in 10 months in which 0 COVID deaths were recorded. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Ollie Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Joe Evans and Saoirse Bradley. And we also welcome back freelancer Chandrika. Did I mention the suburbs are experiencing a pandemic-based revival? Chakrabarti. Joe, you are up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Has Emmanuel Macron lost his military might to the French far right?
The French president arrived in the Paris suburb of Les Mureaux to deliver a speech on separatism. Emmanuel Macron said there was no place in French society for divisions along religious lines. The biggest threat to France's values and secular law, he said, was radical Islam.
Al Jazeera's Natasha Butler reporting in October on President Macron's claims radical Islam is the biggest threat to French society. Joe, what's been happening this week?
Yes, so that was Macron telling an audience in Paris, as you say, in October last year, that he was going to free Islam in France from foreign influences and essentially describing it as a religion in crisis. It would appear that for some, Macron hasn't gone far enough, because this week he is facing something of a mutiny with his armed forces. Thousands of serving French military personnel have publicly accused him of leading the country to the brink of a civil war with Islamists. This was come out through a letter that was published in a right-wing magazine called Valeurs Actuelles, and essentially it's a warning to Macron that if he doesn't halt suburban hordes, is the quote, of Muslims overrunning France, he might face a military coup.
But these are servicemen and women that have signed this letter that are anonymised, right? We don't know who they are.
That's quite right. We don't know exactly how many there are. They've described themselves in the letter as a generation of fire, and the only other thing we know about them is that they claim to have served in the Sentinel security operation, which was set up after domestic terror attacks in January 2015. The thing that is slightly interesting about this letter is that it can also be signed by members of the public, and it has so far been signed by 250,000 people on the Valeurs Actuelles website.
Okay, so before we talk about the content of the letter, let's just talk about the context, I guess. I saw the Interior Minister, Saoirse, has accused the servicemen of staging a big political manoeuvre. What is the role of the far right in French politics at the moment, and how might this letter indicate what we think about the elections coming up next year?
It's something that's certainly, I think, on the ascendancy in France. I think you can see that with Macron's kind of move more to the right on issues such as immigration. And I think that shows that Marine Le Pen's agenda is cutting through and is something that Macron thinks he needs to address. And I think what this letter is picking up on is social issues that French people are concerned about, and I think that the public feels are going unaddressed. But at the same time, I think, this is a bit of a tool from the far right to capitalise on those fears as well.
Yeah, it does make you wonder how you'd feel, Chandrika, if you were a Muslim soldier fighting in the French army and you knew that so many of your servicemen and women felt this way about Muslims. It's not just about radical Islamic extremism, is it? It is about Muslims.
Yeah, well, the French army is meant to be apolitical, first of all, so this seems to be out of character for them. And secondly, Macron was very concerned with increasing diversity in the police and the army, as well, so it could be a bit of pushback against that. But it does seem as though Marine Le Pen is kind of capitalising on her association with the possible writers of this letter, because we do have some possible identities. But there's long been concerns on the French left about the level of support for the extreme right in the police and the armed forces, because, as I said, the armed forces are meant to be apolitical. And it does seem that Marine Le Pen's party is the most popular single political party in the country as a whole. She does seem to be a real threat to Macron if he does indeed run. And a recent poll published in the French paper Le Monde showed that Le Pen is on about 43% of support compared to Macron's 57%. So she's definitely kind of using certain tactics to push forward and get more attention and to keep attacking Macron.
So I do think, this letter picks up on issues that have a lot of traction with the French public, and 58% of the French public said that they backed the the letter, and 73% said France was disintegrating. So there is a high level of concern there. But I still think just because a letter picks up on concerns, that doesn't then imply that there is any level of consent for, a French military coup, for example. I think that would kind of be a logical fallacy. I think one doesn't necessarily follow the other, and those concerns can exist without there being any real viable risk of a military coup like this letter implies.
I mean, it's inevitable, isn't it, Joe, that, a large slice of the French public would feel concerned. They legitimately have had many troubling encounters with Islamic extremism in the past few years, without even re-Googling it to reacquaint myself. I could name the Charlie Hebdo attack and the Paris attacks and the school beheadings. They have been much blighted by that. But with regard to servicemen and women, I mean, you do wonder whether perhaps they haven't been supported enough as their role has pivoted to deal with this concern. Like, obviously, if you're serving in the French forces and you're now policing French Muslims as a threat with regard to extremism, that is a shift in how you are operating, and you need to be supported through that so that you see the context, so you don't lose perspective on the scale of the problem. And I wonder if that's been done.
Absolutely, and specifically in relation to the military, actually, French military involvement in Africa in order to try and suppress the rise of radical Islam in Africa is also very prominent, which is one of the reasons that actually the death of Chad's dictator a couple of weeks ago was so interesting, because that is a country with which France has a very close security alliance. I do sort of see where you're coming from in terms of a pivot, in terms of what the military's responsibilities are. The difficulty is that, as Saoirse points out, there is a rising tide of anger about not only radical Islam, but just Islam generally, actually, in France. And I think we've discussed previously on the podcast about this kind of the idea of laïcité in France and how they're very proud of their republican values. And I think this is actually where this is coming from, rather than a sort of desire to highlight the shifting role of the military in French society. And on that topic, people like Macron are tacking to the right very strongly. You have people like his interior minister, admonishing people like Marine Le Pen on television for not taking a strong enough stance against Islam, which, when he was elected a few years ago would have just seemed like a bizarre situation to have ended up in. He also actually recently barred a Muslim candidate from running their local election because she was photographed wearing a hijab in the campaign literature. And so I think that actually what this letter is doing, and one of the reasons for, I think, the surprising level of support among the French public for this, is it is tapping into this distinctly French sense of republicanism and atheism, specifically in relation to the state. And I think that is actually where the support for the letters come from.
Yeah, and another thing about the French, Sachandrika, is they are famously more willing to protest their views. They're more willing to strike. They're more willing to make their opinions heard because they're so firmly anchored in this kind of national republicanism. I mean, the Yellow Vest movement springs to mind most recently. So do you think, like that, this will pass eventually, or is it a more troubling flag?
That's an interesting one, isn't it? Because Macron still hasn't escaped the shadow of the Gilets jaunes, or the Yellow Vests. So that started as a fuel tax protest and it became a kind of wider, we're unhappy with the government movement. And we still talk about them. The shadow is still there. And for Marine Le Pen, that's an opportunity for her party to get in there and say, Macron's not doing a great job, I will do a better one. Even though there are lots of downsides to her party getting in, apart from how far they are to the right. I mean, her economic plans are always the bit on which she's defeated. So she is really taking advantage of the fact that there is dissatisfaction. There's also dissatisfaction with the rollout of the vaccine within France. So that makes them a bit anti-EU as well at the moment. And so her party is really taking advantage of these feelings against the establishment and thinking we can get in there.
Saoirse, if Macron is moving more to the right to try and combat this latest shift in thinking, is it a case of him trying to win over the traditional, if you like, Le Pen voters, or are there newbies as well in this space?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that actually amongst young people, 25 to 34, French far-right parties are incredibly popular and they're ranking ahead of almost any other French political party. So I think in moving further to the right, he is appealing to a large part of his base who originally voted him in. And I think that French far right is so popular in that age group. You can also link that to the military and kind of the fears of far right rising within the military. And they have had several high profile stories have come out of the military in France where they've found soldiers filming neo-Nazi videos, and the French army said these were isolated incidents. But a French think tank has found that 4 in 10 French soldiers vote for far-right parties, and soldiers tend to be younger. So these are, it's all kind of feeding into, these several elements are feeding into kind of this letter, really.
I mean, in terms of those people in the military, Joe, the elected president of France is head of the military in France. That's how it works. So if you have these feelings, technically, according to the way that France is constituted, you should leave the military, shouldn't you? You shouldn't be signing a letter.
Well, no, quite right, and that's exactly what the Interior Minister has suggested that these soldiers should do. It should also be said that very senior members of the armed forces have also condemned the letter and said they will try and root out the signatories if possible. The difficulty, I think, here is that Macron doesn't seem to quite know how to deal with the backlash over both actually his approach to Islam in France and also the specific letter. You know, En Marche are kind of in the strange situation that they're sort of sending ministers on chat shows to condemn the soldiers for dangerously crossing the line, while simultaneously sort of agreeing with them. There was an En Marche MP who said that the soldiers are talking about insecurity, repeated attacks against institutions such as the police, the army, and it's the reality. At the same time, he said that they shouldn't be signing letters like this. And I think this does sort of speak to a tension within the heart of Macron's party, that they can't quite decide whether they want to tack to the right to try and head off this rising support, especially as Sorcha says, among young people for Le Pen, while simultaneously remaining true to their sort of liberal values on which they were elected in the first place. And I think that'll be very interesting in the run-up to the election next April to see how Macron's party decides to fight that battle.
And Joe, you've chosen this as your story of the week because, understandably, you know, it's not something we're hearing much about and it's indicative of an interesting trend in France. But do you think in 6 months, 9 months' time, we'll look back on this moment as a significant moment or not?
I have to be honest, I think that will depend on whether or not Macron wins in April next year. It's almost certainly going to end up in a runoff between Macron and Le Pen. Le Pen, as Chitandika said earlier, is polling within 10 points of Macron. I think that these moments will start to feel somewhat more prophetic if Le Pen goes on to win that election next year. If she doesn't, then I think France will probably, France and many European Union nations will breathe a sigh of relief that France has somehow avoided populist backlash for the second time.
Very elegantly done, although you're right. The subtext of my question was, is Le Pen going to win the election or is Macron? What do you think?
I wouldn't want to guess yet, but if you were going to twist my arm, Ollie, I would say that I think Macron will possibly win again.
OK, I'll take that. Sorcha, I'm coming to you next after this.
This podcast is brought to you by Aria Resorts Homes, providing sensational holiday homes and staycation investments. Aria Resorts sells luxurious holiday homes in top UK locations with a 7% annual net return available to qualifying investors at a choice of 3 resorts. Terms and conditions apply. Find out more by searching Aria Resorts Investment.
OK, Sorcha, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week Facebook said, let's get them when they're young?
I want to start by asking all three of you if your platform bears some responsibility for disseminating disinformation related to the election and the Stop the Steal movement that led to the attack on the Capitol. Just a yes or no answer. Mr. Zuckerberg.
Chairman, I think our responsibility is to build systems that can help.
Mr. Zuckerberg, I just want a yes or no answer, okay? Yes or no, do you bear some responsibility for what happened?
Congressman, our responsibility is to make sure that we build effective systems to help fight this.
The gentleman's choice is not to answer the question. Mr. Pichai, yes or no?
We always feel a deep sense of responsibility, but I think we worked hard. This election effort was one of our most substantive efforts.
Is that a yes or a no?
Congressman, it's a complex question.
Okay, we'll move on.
Top tech CEOs Zuckerberg, Dorsey and Pichai testifying in a congressional hearing over misinformation back in March. Sorcha relevant because this week, Facebook's relationship with US lawmakers is coming into focus again.
Yeah, so at that congressional hearing, one thing lawmakers were very keen to talk about was plans from Facebook to possibly launch a version of its photo sharing app Instagram for children under 13. So this week, 44 attorneys general signed a letter calling for the plans to be scrapped, as did public health advocates around the world.
So despite the pressure, Facebook are still proceeding at the moment with this idea, are they? Instagram for kids?
Well, it's a plan that it's in its really early stages, but it's being explored by the social media as part of a plan to keep under 13s off Instagram, amongst other age verification methods. But this is one idea that they're really keen to explore.
How does that work? You want to keep kids off Instagram, so you create Instagram for kids?
Yeah, well, they say children are already on Instagram and using these social media platforms when they're too young to legally be allowed to.
Because they're pretending, they're lying, they're saying they're 15 or whatever.
Yeah, okay. Exactly. So they're pretending to be older than they are. And they say this is a way we can ensure that children are using social media in a safe way, in a way that can be monitored.
And what do we know about what it might look like if it ever does launch? What's going to be different about it compared to Instagram?
Well, we don't know very much because, as I say, it's in its really early stages. But Facebook have tried to reassure the public that it will be a platform that is, they say, controlled by parents and monitored by parents. But obviously, parents and lawmakers and campaign groups are already imagining all sorts of horrors that could come from it. Obviously, there's huge child protection issues possibly at play. There's issues over tracking the data of children. There's issues over moderation, who moderates these sites. So, yeah, there's potentially some big issues coming Facebook's way.
Yeah, and those are very boldly set out, aren't they, Joe, in the lawmaker's letter to Facebook? I'll quote, "Use of social media can be detrimental to the health and well-being of children who are not equipped to navigate the challenges of having a social media account. Further, Facebook has historically failed to protect the welfare of children on its platforms." There's not really sort of any room for interpretation or doubt, or let's give them a chance. It's almost as if people just accept now there is evidence social media is damaging, this shouldn't be happening.
No, that's true. It should be said that Facebook has said that it is happy to work with these lawmakers and regulators in order to develop the platform. And I suppose their counter-argument there would be, if the position of the lawmakers is Facebook is it is bad for kids and we accept that as a position, I suppose Facebook's argument would be, well, you're acknowledging the fact that they're on Facebook, so let's develop a project or a platform that is more suitable. It should be said that I'm just going to get out there nice and early that I think this is a terrible idea. We know so much about how social media affects people's mental health, was the first thing that came to mind. And as more data comes out about the way that social media does impact people, especially young people, and actually even more specifically young girls, I do think that we'll consider it incredibly irresponsible for us to have allowed kids to have so much access to social media at such a young age. And it does strike me that this is just an extension of that issue, regardless of whether or not the platform is designed in such a way that it isn't supposed to trigger these issues that are triggered by, for lack of a better description, the adult version of Facebook.
Yes, but is this just tinkering at the edges, Sachandrika? I mean, lawmakers getting hot under the collar about children potentially being groomed, their location potentially being known. But meanwhile, there are zero age checks on accessing hardcore pornography. So, I mean, it's sort of, in a way, it's easy to attack Facebook, isn't it, as one of the huge corporations that runs the internet, but the internet's actually an open thing with even more malevolent forces than that.
Yeah, it does feel like a distraction, doesn't it? Like, let's talk about this walled garden of Instagram for children, which is still open to abuse and people getting on it without checks. And also children themselves. You give a 13-year-old a book meant for a 13-year-old, they're not reading it. They want the book meant for a 15-year-old or 17-year-old or a magazine. Like, we were all the same. That's how it works. Like, they're in the children's section of the library and they are dying to leave it. So it doesn't work for children. They'll find it boring and uncool. Or even the word chuggy, which I learnt this week, which means out of date. And now I've made it worse by saying it's even more out of date. So children, I think, will probably not want to be on it beyond the age of 10. But also, this conversation is really about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So this is a legal shield that protects platforms from liability for their users' posts and allows them to moderate content as they see fit. So really, the leaders of these big tech companies are there to talk about this, but it's a useful distraction for the media to have this like baby version of Instagram, which can't work anyway. So I'm not sure that's really what the leaders of these tech companies care about. I think they're there to make sure they're talking about how little responsibility they need to take on for their own platforms.
I mean, that point about children quickly tiring of something that's obviously aimed at younger children, Sorcho, that's something I'm very aware of because there's I don't know if you know, but there's a kids version of iPlayer, which my kids watch when I pass them an iPad. And it's great because they are 2 and 5 years old. So, of course, the CBeebies stuff is relevant to them. But I can already see in the 5-year-old that the environment built for the 2-year-old is beginning to feel a bit babyish to him. And that's why we have CBBC, which is kind of roughly for age 7+. There is that natural divide. An 8-year-old even might not feel comfortable in Instagram for kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even thinking back on my own childhood, I remember using sites like Neopets or Club Penguin. You know, these were sites ostensibly designed for children, but over 13s, they said. But I think all my peers were on it from much younger, from 10, 11. So yeah, there is just that natural want, as you say, not to want to do babyish things and be on babyish sites.
Did you ever find them unsafe spaces, by the way? Is it something that you recognise?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's kind of possibly why there's so much concern and fear coming up now, because people kind of around my age and a bit older are starting to have children and realizing, thinking about, oh, hang on, I remember what it was actually like on those message boards when I was 11, and it was a bit of a wild west, and there were situations when you could have been in serious danger. And I think
from what? From adults who were sexually interested?
Yeah, I think, I think lots of people have stories of encountering adults posing as children. There's no way of knowing, obviously, to this day, the real age of someone on the other end. Chat roulette, if anyone remembers chat roulette. I mean, hundreds of thousands of children have, been exposed to sexual content from those kinds of sites. And I would say that, Facebook itself, who owns Instagram, does not have a good track record of protecting children on its sites already. There are 20 million child sex abuse images were uploaded to Facebook in 2020 alone. That's shocking. And they've got an app that was designed for children to use, a messenger app. And there was a flaw in that app that allowed 6 to 12-year-old users to join group chats with other users who had not been authorized by their parents. So making the whole point of the child's app for Facebook completely pointless. It was a safety feature that completely failed. And I would also point out that the head of Instagram, Adam Mosseri, blocks his children's face when he posts pictures of them to Instagram. So I think for me, that really suggests that, Instagram executives don't really even think that they can keep children safe online if the head of Instagram feels the need to do that.
Yeah, I also don't understand, Joe, if one of the problems is adults in a children's safe space, how it's then a positive to bring to market to say to parents, you can control what your kids are doing. You can see what your kids are doing. Surely, as soon as you say adults are controlling what their children are doing, that necessitates having grown-ups, some of whom can pretend to be the child's parents, in the so-called safe space. That the model necessitates adults being there.
Yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I think that the counter to that is that it just does make life easier for safeguarding children, which I think is a completely acceptable explanation. The point being that if we accept the fact that kids are using social media and we can't put the lid back on that bottle, then having a safeguarded area which is facilitated by grown-ups, their parents, whoever it is probably preferable. I think it's also worth mentioning, just in relation to this, that I think it maps quite interestingly onto the right to be forgotten debate, especially, it does make me slightly uncomfortable to think that sort of data delivered onto, say, Instagram for kids would be there forever, and that it would allow third parties to track you for the rest of your life through stuff that you posted when you were, between the ages of 7 and 13. I think that's a slightly uncomfortable thought. And I appreciate there's lots of counter-arguments to the right to be forgotten for, things about censorship and rewriting of history. But I do think it is worth raising in relation to, deliberately designing a platform in which you want kids to upload data that they have chosen to upload onto the internet when they might not realise that that's going to be there forever.
Although from that point of view, Suchandrika, it sort of does make sense, doesn't it, to have it all annexed off into one app, so that when you then cancel your profile when you're 12 or 13 and you're so horrendously embarrassed by those videos, presumably will be easier to delete that content from the internet than it would be on traditional Instagram.
I guess there is this thing around encouraging children to upload personal images and videos to the internet from a young age, because anything can be screenshot, anything can be recorded. That's true of Snapchat, which, the whole thing around Snapchat is that things disappear, but then suddenly they might reappear on the show business pages of a website. So there are tricks and easy ways to record these things. And another thing I'm wondering about as well is that there's a whole sort of class of parenting influencers who put their babies online and put their infants online. And sometimes children grow up and they're not happy with that, or they ask the parent to take those things down. But isn't it easy for those parenting influencers to then graduate their children onto the next platform? They're like, now the kid's 5, it's time for baby Instagram. And it kind of adds to that feeling of like they can kind of be like accessories for parents who want to be celebrities and want to be seen as parenting influencers. So it just feels to me as though it'll be a natural progression, which is dangerous in that way, but also it'll be a distraction for the press who'll keep talking about child Instagram, where much more dangerous things and worrying things are happening on the standard Instagram as well. So it just feels like a distraction.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? If the Jackson 5 were around today, they would be influencers, wouldn't they? They wouldn't be a boy band. Okay. So Chandrika, you're up next after this. So Chandrika, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week that your poker face comes into its own?
Emotion recognition is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Companies scan the details of your face and harvest your expressions as data. Emotion recognition systems can be used in job interviews, claiming to tell how enthusiastic or honest you are. Airport security can use it to flag you. And if you are a defendant on trial, an emotion recognition system could scan your expressions and be used to help determine your innocence or guilt.
Will emotional recognition technology emojify you? A video from February uploaded to the YouTube channel Emojify Project. So Chandrika, I didn't even realise emojify was a word. What's its relevance to this week's news? And should we all be worried?
Yes, to the second question. So, this week, a coalition of artists and human rights advocates have written an open letter to Spotify. So it's a week of
another letter.
Open letters.
All 3 stories this week have been about open letters.
Yeah.
Who knew letter writing was back? That's the real story, isn't it?
It's all about the letter writing these days. And get those quills out, guys. And so they are requesting the company doesn't use this recently patented technology that will listen to user conversations and then recommend content based on perceived emotions. Is utterly terrifying, because so the letter says monitoring emotional states and making recommendations based on it deploys this tech in a dangerous position of power, and also it's terrifying, and then also using artificial intelligence and surveillance. So there's so much in this.
Well, hold on. I mean, yes, we will have the conversation about the natural concerns around this being wiretapped and all the rest of it. But A, Spotify aren't using this technology at the moment, right? They've just developed it and they're not using it. B, they're a private company and you choose to subscribe to their service. So if they ever were to activate this, you'd know that that's what you were opting into. And C, presumably the reason they would want to develop it, if ever they did activate it, would just be to sell you some more appropriate ads and to work out what kind of music you want to listen to. I mean, is that really so terrifying?
Well, what they add in the letter is that marketing element. Yeah, does this marketing element make it less scary? Well, they say that that exacerbates existing disparities in the music industry. So you're going to hear more about famous acts and less about sort of grassroots new acts coming up. And music should be made for human connection, not to please a profit-maximising algorithm, they say, which I think is a good thing.
Right. But if you're a user and you are having a conversation about, I don't know, S Club 7, do you remember that song? And then Spotify decides you'd like to hear some more boy and girl bands from the 90s. That's not narrowing your horizons. It is relevant content.
I mean, it's kind of using a huge violation of human rights in order to market you music. So it's kind of a really horrible invasion for something that's not very important, is I guess what they're talking about in the letter. Even though music is so important. But is the hearing more 90s bands that important?
Well, Joe, you tell me. I mean, is there a point that it's a private company and they can do what they want and users can choose whether to use it or not?
No, I don't think that's the point. It's wonderfully naive, isn't it, that quote from the letter that music should be for human connection, not to please a profit-maximising algorithm when they're writing to Spotify. But no, I don't think that is a fair point, because as we've just discussed Facebook and Alphabet, the company that owns Google, and all of these product companies that collect huge amounts of data on us, and, I don't think that it's necessarily a strong enough argument to say, well, you have a choice not to use it. These are massive market leaders in the industry. They have basically monopolised the industries that they operate in. And if Spotify was to launch this type of sort of emotion recognition software, as Chandrika describes just now, then I don't think that actually just saying, well, you could go and use a different streaming service is an adequate response to the human rights concerns around this.
Okay, let's talk about how this emotional recognition could work? Because what I understand, Sorcha, is it kind of doesn't anyway.
Yeah, well, the problem that most campaigners have really is that they think that this is all emotional recognition is based off of pseudoscience and basically discredited theories from the 1960s. So facial recognition technology makes the assumption that one, facial expressions are universal, and two, that we can glean some understanding of an inner emotional state by way of facial expressions. But actually, facial expressions are not universal. I think lots of people would argue that they're cultural and contextual as well.
Like what? Because I've seen, like, the scowl, for example, I've seen as a controversial one. Because people don't just scowl when they're angry. They can scowl when they're, I guess, squinting.
Yeah, well, for example, the tests that have been run have shown that, one, facial recognition technology is very inaccurate. And two, there have been studies to show that these AI algorithms, actually, I think this is something that is like widely talked about to do with AI technology, is that often we put our own implicit biases into the algorithms. And there's been lots of studies to show that facial recognition and emotional recognition can be racist. There are studies that have shown that black faces are analysed as being much more angry than white faces. So there's all sorts of issues with those kinds of results.
But presumably Suchandrika, a technologist, would say, well, the reason it seems to have this implicit bias against black people, for example, is that not enough black people have been involved in the software development, and that's a problem, and we'll talk about that separately, but the way to resolve that is to get the whole world using it. Then they'll see plenty of black faces, and that bias will be removed. It's only ever going to improve if it's actually put out there into the world.
Yeah, we've got sort of, I mean, it's been called pseudoscience in some reports, this kind of technology, because there's three problematic assumptions that underlie using the stuff and understanding emotions as data. So firstly, as Sorcha and Joe have mentioned, that facial expressions, they're not universal, and emotional states aren't always the same. You can't always unearth the emotional state from the facial expression. I think as just human beings, we spend a lot of time wondering what other people think and if they meant what they said in that way. And like we have that in our own relationships. So for an AI to understand us, you know, I don't think that can happen so easily. And then thirdly, what we're deciding is an emotional state from the look of someone's face, is that reliable enough to use to make decisions? Sometimes a person themselves doesn't know what they are feeling or doesn't have the insight or self-awareness. So where does the actual truth lie in how they're feeling, and how can that be used as any kind of data point? Like, it seems like we're trying to make a science of something that is neither art or science, but it's completely nuanced and hidden and secret, which is someone's emotions. We can't ever be sure.
Maybe I'm taking my devil's advocate role too far, Joe. As you're talking, I am just thinking, yeah, but I mean, like, you know, on Gmail, for example, you know, it does that thing where you write the word attachment and you haven't put an attachment, and then it sends a prompt when you press send saying, are you sure? You sure you haven't put the attachment on? Is it really that far removed for me to give it permission to access my mobile phone camera and for it to just say, you know, it would still be my choice, for it to just say, you look quite upset at the moment. Are you sure you want to send this now? Shouldn't you send this in 6 hours' time? Might that not actually be a welcome feature?
Yeah, or you look quite upset now. Would you like to listen to some Enya on your Spotify app? I think that the problem here is twofold. The first one is, does the technology work well enough? To which the answer at the moment seems to be no. And then there's a second question, which is, do you actually want the technology to improve? Because the fundamental goal here, right, is to make humans less inscrutable and make them easier to predict, and also predict in large numbers, preferably. You know, if you were to be able to set these up in train stations and read the facial expressions of everybody in the train station, you might be able to stop a terror attack, for example, because you would be able to spot the person in the crowd. That, I think, is where the problem is, and whether facial expression algorithms should be used on that scale, and whether they should ever be used to make decisions about how humans react, specifically in that instance of a train station where it would be without your permission. You know, the counter-argument might be that it could be small print on your train ticket, but if the small print says the only way you can get on the train is by walking past a facial recognition camera, then that's not really seeking consent, is it? This is an issue that the EU is actually very concerned about, because the EU loves to regulate, and especially on emerging technologies. And last month they did actually discuss AI regulation, which is a thing they consider to be high risk, specifically emotion recognition technology, because they're considered to be high risk. And so I think there is the two issues.
Well, now, I mean, the last story was all about a lack of regulation, wasn't it? You know, you've got these lawmakers attacking Facebook for developing an app for children, And Facebook essentially saying, well, tell us not to then. And we've got the same thing here. Really? I mean, doesn't it put, rather than writing open letters, don't both of these stories taken together point at a problem, which is there is not enough up-to-date regulation for these huge internet companies to tell them how to behave?
I mean, that's definitely the case. And I think it's also definitely the case that actually the companies are just far too big to try and regulate because they're incredibly powerful and have huge lobbying arms. So perhaps the French military could write a letter to Spotify and see if they can resolve the issue.
And, in places like China, this technology is being trialled in seriously scary ways, I would say. So it's being trialled for use by police. So they would use this technology whilst interrogating suspects to assess their emotional state, which is obviously something that could potentially be used against them during an interrogation. And it's also being used to monitor the concentration levels of high school students in classrooms. So this is really invasive stuff and kind of touches upon a lot of, as we've mentioned before, a lot of human rights issues, such as the right to freedom of expression and, really importantly, the right against self-incrimination. So, there's a lot of implications of allowing this technology to kind of creep into everyday life.
And yet, Sachandrika, Spotify are not using this patent. I mean, they have filed it, but they're not using it. So do you think there's perhaps always going to be pressure on these technology companies at the moment to, even if they are interested in these avenues, ultimately not voice them onto the public?
I mean, why file the patent? Why build up your nuclear armaments? It just feels like, why have it there and just not switch it on yet? It feels like they're going to use it at some point, right? And they may find out a legal way to not have to tell us, or they do tell us, but if our emotional reaction is XYZ, then they don't have to do anything to make us happier about it. So I think it is worrying that they have patented this. They're just meant to be there to entertain us, but they're clearly looking to do more and actually find data on us that could end up controlling us. And as Saoirse mentioned, with some of these trials in China, which are really terrifying, like this emotion recognition technology has been discredited by scientists for years, but that's not stopping their market growth in China. And so Joe mentioned that this kind of technology is trying to almost predict human behaviour, and if you can predict human behaviour, you can start to try and control it. And so, is it shocking that it's being trialled in Japan? In Japan, oh my god! Is it shocking that it's being trialled in China, which historically has had a dictatorship that wouldn't mind using something like this?
And I would say, I think there's also potentially mental health discrimination consequences of collecting data on people's emotional states. People are allowed to be sad. If you're at work or at school, you're allowed to be angry, you're allowed to be frustrated. And the fact that expressing those emotions in a public place could have greater consequences than simply feeling your emotions is a scary thought.
I would confuse the algorithm, I'm sure about that, because these cheekbones that I was born with, it looks like I'm always smiling. Inside, I can be deeply frustrated. But I suppose if Spotify just anticipated that I always want to hear more Barry Manilow, that would broadly be right. My thanks to Joe, Sachandrika and Saoirse for their stories. Remember, you can subscribe to this show for free. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts, including Spotify, like no shade, no beef. I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.